Let's begin with the obvious. The tremolo melody is king. Keep it the most prominent of all the parts at all times. To make the melody prominent, maintain a light touch with the thumb. So if we're playing just the accompaniment, we're talking feather light touch, especially when you're practicing developing your tremolo. So like that. What that does, you're going to vary that depending on the volume of the tremolo itself, but when you're playing if you can maintain that feather light touch like that, then when you're playing the tremolo quietly, you'll have a good balance. And then when you want to play loud, it'll be no problem to keep the thumb quiet in the background as you dig into the tremolo. It'll make everything much easier once you develop that light touch with the thumb. Tardiga indicates accents in the accompaniment on the second and third beat of each measure. So let's indicate it. Accent, 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 accent. Okay? Now, I prefer to accent these notes not by consciously accenting them like I just did, but rather by playing all the other notes in the accompaniment more quietly. So what I would do would be to play quiet, quiet, normal, quiet, normal, quiet, 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 normal, quiet, normal, quiet, 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 normal, quiet, normal, quiet, 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 normal, quiet. That way you accomplish the feeling of those notes being louder, but yet your accompaniment will still stay underneath the tremolo. Just like that. Vibrato may be used liberally throughout the piece and is especially effective on chords falling in the middle to upper regions of the fretboard. For instance, in part 1, here, very nice to vibrato through here. Not only are you in the upper regions of the fretboard, but you're on the inner string, so it makes it easy to hear the vibrato. And continuing on here, very nice. So I would use it there. And the second half, another very good example, is where it goes up high. Very nice place to add the vibrato. It makes the tone shimmer through that passage. So anywhere you can, especially on the inside strings, middle to upper part of the fretboard, it's very easily heard and adds a lot of warmth to your tone. Fingering choices affect the timbre and overall mood of this piece. In the first half, the A minor section, Tardiga fingers much of the melody on the second string. So we have these harmonies. Opening part like that, and that results in the A minor section having a dark timbre and somber mood. However, in the second half, the A major section, he fingers more of the melody on the first string. So we have these harmonies there right away, open, brighter sound. This gives it an overall bright timbre and a sunnier mood. Now, it's not necessary nor recommended that you slavishly follow Tardiga's fingering, but be aware of this general scheme. Many of the fingering options I provide have a decidedly dark or bright tone color. Sometimes you will choose a fingering that's easy for you to play. Now that's fine, but when choosing, also take into account the consequences of its tone color as well. Tardiga specifies andante, which means walking pace in the published version, but the manuscript specifies andantino. Andantino usually means slightly faster than andante, but in some cases is taken to mean slightly slower than andante. So it's really difficult to interpret its meaning. Now, depending on who you believe, metronome settings for andante range from 56 to 108 beats per minute. That's an extremely wide range, so it really is not helpful at all. You will hear guitarists play the piece at anywhere from 70 to 92 for a quarter note. Now here's 70. Now that's a very leisurely tempo, and if you play slower than 70, the tremolo begins to lose its unique quality. At the other end of the spectrum, here's 92. Now that's pretty fast, and you'll find if you play faster than that, the piece really begins to race and lose its poetic and reflective mood. Personally, if we're counting eighth notes, I prefer the range of 145 to 155 beats per minute. 152 beats sounds like this. Now that might seem too fast, too slow to you. You'll have to experiment with different tempos and see what you personally prefer. Plus you'll find it will vary with time. As you get more comfortable with the tremolo, you may decide, well, I think I want to play a little faster. It will also depend on the room in which you're playing. A very reverberant auditorium, concert hall, or a church, you can play slower because of the reverb. The notes kind of run together. Whereas in a room that's more dead acoustically, you'll need to play slightly faster to fill in the blank spaces between the notes. So lots of experimentation will be in order. Tardiga indicates dynamics only for the first four measures. Now when a composer uses this type of notation, if interpreted literally, it means the same pattern is to be used until the composer indicates a change. In this case, he intends for the pattern to be used throughout the piece until the very end when he specifies pianissimo in measure 55. Now, I've notated Tardiga's crescendo-decrescendo pattern throughout the piece, and it would sound like this. He starts loud, down, crescendo back up, down, crescendo back up, but down, and back up. And continues like that. Now, other schemes of dynamics can also be used. In fact, we can do just the exact opposite of what Tardiga indicated. We can start quietly, crescendo, decrescendo, crescendo, decrescendo, crescendo, and decrescendo. Crescendo, decrescendo, etc. Or we can do 2-measure crescendos and decrescendos. For instance, the red scheme would sound like this. Soft, crescendo, then decrescendo, soft, crescendo, crescendo, loud, then decrescendo, soft, like that. Or we can do the opposite of that. We could start loud, do a 2-measure decrescendo, then crescendo for 2 measures, decrescendo for 2 measures, crescendo for 2 measures, etc., like that. You don't have to stick with one scheme throughout the piece. You can jump from one scheme to another as you wish, often within the same phrase. And also, be sure to change your dynamics on the repeats. You don't want to be predictable. It's possible to slow down or linger at the apex of almost any crescendo Tardiga has indicated. But don't overdo this rubato effect. You have to use it judiciously and sparingly. For instance, the very first note, we can hesitate at the beginning. Crescendo, hesitate. Here's another crescendo, hesitate. Another crescendo, hesitate. Nice one to hesitate on is this one. Like that. Now, again, don't do that everywhere. Maybe maybe at the most 6 times in the entire piece is plenty. Choose the spots carefully. If you want to use it at all, it's just a possibility. In the intermediate stages of learning Recuerdos, I believe it's very beneficial to decide on a definite scheme of dynamics, tone color changes, and rubato. In other words, decide exactly where you want to crescendo, decrescendo, play loud, play soft, make a change of tone color, etc. And remember, on the color-coded crescendo-decrescendo schemes I give you in the annotated interpretation score, you don't have to stick with one scheme all the way through. In fact, I would recommend against it. Mix them up quite a bit. You can jump from one scheme to another. And by all means, change it up on the repeats. You don't ever want to be predictable. Guys, ask any woman. The dynamic range of the classical guitar is very small, so we have to use a few tricks to make it seem larger. Exaggerate your dynamics so they are heard. This is especially important when you play softly. When you play softly, play very softly. It is difficult to play a tremolo softly, but work on it. When you play the quiet parts very softly, it makes the loud parts sound louder in comparison. This increases the perceived dynamic range. Another reason I say to exaggerate the dynamics is because you know when you're trying to crescendo and decrescendo. The dynamics are obvious to you, but I will guarantee you that unless you exaggerate your dynamics, they will not be obvious to your listeners. In the intermediate stages of learning the piece, master the technical control and nuances of your dynamic scheme and other interpretive devices. At first, you'll have to mechanically think, okay, I crescendo here to this high chord, and then I decrescendo to the A minor chord. I linger at the top of this crescendo. I darken my tone color here. I slow down here. I vibrato this passage. You'll be thinking all those things consciously. But in the final stages of mastery, you must entirely change how you think as you play the piece. You must free yourself of thinking about the mechanical details of the tremolo, your dynamics, tone color changes, etc. The ultimate goal is to allow Recuerdos to carry you away to another place. One choice is to be literal and let it take you to the Alhambra. As you play, you will see the buildings, the water, hear the birds, and hear the fountains. But it's even better if you personalize the piece. Remember, the title of the piece is Memories of the Alhambra. Use your memories. Let Recuerdos take you to a place or time that is very memorable to you personally and that affected you deeply. Or think of a person, someone in your life who touched you very deeply. If you think of that place, time, or person as you play the piece, it will bring the piece alive for you and your listeners. Your dynamics, rubato, tone color changes, everything will become more focused and become part of you and the music. As Recuerdos becomes part of your story and your memories, feel free to change your dynamics and other interpretive devices to fit your narrative. Think about your narrative, not your technique or dynamics as you play the piece. Rather than an academic execution of crescendi, decrescendi, and changes of tone color, your performance will be transformed into a magical experience. As you peruse the annotated interpretation score, you'll see a few extra comments sprinkled here and there. For instance, this is something I already mentioned, but the section in A minor, the very first section, has a generally dark mood. I would play it more over the sound hole to produce and accentuate that dark tone quality. Unless you choose a fingering on open strings, then that's a different story. You might want to not want to do that. But again, I think overall, I think it's a good choice to make to begin a little bit more over the sound hole at the beginning of the piece. Likewise, for the second section in A major, it has a generally brighter mood, as I mentioned earlier. So I would play it maybe an inch or so below the sound hole, down here, rather than at the sound hole or over the sound hole. Move down a little bit to give it a little brighter tone quality. Of course, we don't want to get too bright or tinny for sure, but just a slight adjustment, like I said, an inch perhaps below the sound hole at the very most, would do it. Measure 27, 28, 29, I mentioned, we're playing along. I mentioned to darken to measure 29. That's a nice effect because you're going to an F sharp minor chord, a rather dark sound there, measure 29. So that's a nice little touch you can use. Once you're there at measure 29, you can stay dark for quite a while, all the way through to measure 35, and then brighten up for the repeat to measure 21. That's a very nice effect as well. But again, you want to make sure this coincides with your conception of the piece. The repeats on Recuerdos can be treated a number of ways. As written, you play the first section, the A minor section, twice, and then you play the A major section through measure 36, taking the first ending and repeating back to measure 21, play the A major section again, and then you take the second ending, measure 37, and then that takes you back to the very beginning of the piece, and then you play straight through the minor section and major section, no repeats, to measure 35, through measure 35, and then jump to the coda, which is measure 38. That's as written. Lots of times what I do, I play the first section twice, the second section twice, and I skip the second ending I go directly from measure 35 to the coda rather than going back to the beginning. Depending on circumstances, if you have to make the piece even shorter, you could skip the repeat of the first section, skip the repeat of the second section, and go directly to the coda. That would make it even shorter. But again, you'll have to experiment with that. I find that playing it as tardigrade wrote, I find it a little long, actually. So that's why I shorten it. But again, these decisions are totally up to you. You do what sounds best to you. When I hit the coda, I prefer a dark sound, so I'm playing over the sound hole. But then measure 40, I gradually brighten to measure 41 with the bright A major chord. But then measure 42, I gradually darken again to go to measure 43, which is this darker sounding E major chord. So, something that you can test out, see if you like it. And then right there in measure 45, a little hairpin crescendo and decrescendo, very nice little touch that you can make. Going on, measure 46, measure 47, a little tenuto there on measure 47 is very effective. It's a little hold, a little lingering, and a little accent on that F natural there. I think it sounds very good. Then I gradually brighten measure 48 back to a brighter sound for measure 49 with the brighter A major sound again with the open E. Now some of this will be affected by your choice of left-hand fingerings too. If you're depending on where you're fingering these chords, whether it's on inner strings or on the open strings, that will affect your color choices. Then at the very end, measure 54, I like to gradually darken to measure 55 and 56. I think it's a nice effect. You'll have the retard plus a decrescendo. And you can continue that retard all the way up to your high chord if you want, or you can maintain more of a direct shoot up to the high chord without slowing down too much. You can continue the decrescendo up to the high chord like that, or you can do a slight crescendo up to the high chord. Then, on those last two chords, you have choices. You can arpeggiate both of them, or you could play them both straight, no arpeggiation at all, or you can arpeggiate one, or neither, arpeggiate the other. Any combination is fine. It's whatever you want to do. And once you play the high chord, you can allow it to resonate. Let the open A ring and go directly to your last chord uninterrupted like that. So it sounds like that. Or you can intentionally mute the strings for total silence between the two chords. That sounds like. So there are a lot of choices, as you can tell, that can be made playing even just those last two measures. So experiment, experiment, experiment. Have fun.